Jesus warned of this final trap before the rapture, the danger hidden in plain sight. Listen to me for a moment, not as a teacher speaking at you, but as a fellow believer speaking with you heart to heart. There is something Jesus Christ warned us about that most people rush past, not because it's hidden in complex theology, but because it sounds too familiar, too normal, too safe. And that is exactly why it is so dangerous. Jesus never raised his voice without reason. When he warned, it was never to frighten, but to prepare. And when he spoke about the last days, he did not focus first on chaos, wars, or disasters. He focused on the condition of the heart. He focused on deception that feels comfortable, faith that becomes routine, and lives that slowly drift into spiritual sleep while still calling his name. Many believers today are watching the world for signs, but few are watching their own hearts. We assume that because we believe, because we know the scriptures, because we expect the rapture, we are automatically ready. But Jesus' warnings were not aimed at unbelievers. They were aimed at people who thought they were standing firm. This final trap doesn't pull people away from Jesus overnight. It slowly dulls urgency. It softens conviction. It replaces watchfulness with familiarity. And before anyone realizes what has happened, the heart that once burned with expectation has settled into comfort. I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here to wake you up, just as Jesus tried to wake his disciples. Because the most dangerous moment is not when faith is attacked, but when faith falls asleep. And if there was ever a time to listen carefully to Jesus' words, it is now. Part 1. Jesus never warned without a reason. When Jesus Christ spoke, he never spoke casually. His words were never random, never emotional filler, never spiritual decoration. Every warning he gave carried intention, love, and urgency. Jesus saw further than anyone else, beyond the moment, beyond the crowd, beyond the cross itself. He saw the generations that would follow, especially those living close to the end. One of the most common mistakes believers make today is assuming that Jesus' warnings were meant mainly for the people standing in front of him 2,000 years ago. We read his words as history instead of instruction. But Jesus spoke with the future in mind. He spoke knowing that a final generation would need his warnings more than any other. When Jesus warned about deception, he did not speak lightly. He said many would be deceived. Not a few. Not only those outside the faith. Many. That should stop us in our tracks. Because deception only works on people who believe they are secure. No one is deceived on purpose. Deception succeeds when confidence replaces vigilance. Jesus never taught that faith automatically equals readiness. In fact, much of his teaching challenges that assumption. He spoke of people who called him Lord but were not known by him. He spoke of servants entrusted with responsibility who grew careless while waiting. He spoke of those who began well but slowly drifted. And here is what we often overlook. Jesus directed these warnings toward his own disciples. The ones who walked with him. The ones who witnessed miracles. The ones who believed. If belief alone were enough, these warnings would not have been necessary. Jesus understood the human heart deeply. We rarely fall away through sudden rebellion. More often, we drift through familiarity. Comfort settles in. Urgency fades. We assume tomorrow will look like today. And little by little, spiritual alertness weakens. That is why Jesus emphasized watching, staying awake, and being ready. Those commands only make sense if spiritual sleep is possible. And spiritual sleep does not mean abandoning faith. It means faith becoming passive. Jesus warned because he knew the final generation would face a unique danger. Not only persecution, not only denial, but distraction, delay, comfort, a slow loss of urgency while still believing all the right things. Notice this carefully. Jesus did not first warn his followers to fear the Antichrist. He warned them to guard their hearts, not to assume, not to grow dull, because a dull heart is easier to trap than a rebellious one. His warnings matter now more than ever. The closer we get to the end, the more subtle the danger becomes. Jesus warned not because he doubted his followers, but because he loved them enough to prepare them. Part 2. The nature of the final trap. The most dangerous trap is never the one that looks evil. It is the one that feels harmless. Jesus' final warnings reveal something deeply unsettling. The greatest threat before the end would not look like open rebellion or obvious darkness. It would look like normal life. People eating, drinking, marrying, planning, building, Nothing sinful on the surface. Life continuing as usual. That is what makes the final trap so effective. It does not pull people away from faith. It pulls urgency out of faith. It does not convince people to reject Jesus. It convinces them to delay readiness. It quietly whispers, "You still have time." This trap works inside belief, not outside it. People still pray, still attend church, still talk about the rapture, but their hearts are no longer watching. Expectation turns into assumption. Relationship slowly turns into routine. Jesus warned about a servant who says in his heart, "My master delays." That single sentence exposes the trap. Delay changes behavior. When people believe there is time, priorities shift, watchfulness fades, compromise becomes easier, distraction feels justified. Notice something important. The servant did not stop believing the master was coming. He simply believed it would not be soon. That is the trap. The enemy does not need believers to deny the rapture. He only needs them to stop expecting it daily. He does not need people to abandon Jesus. He only needs them to grow comfortable without Jesus at the center of their awareness. This trap thrives in comfort, in routine, in constant noise and distraction. It flourishes when life feels stable enough that eternity feels distant. That is why it is especially powerful in the final days. Jesus warned that even the elect could be deceived, not because truth disappears, but because attention does. Hearts become divided, focus shifts, eternal perspective fades behind daily pressure. The final trap convinces believers that being busy for God is the same as being close to God. That knowledge can replace intimacy. That activity can replace surrender. That familiarity can replace the fear of the Lord. And when urgency is lost, readiness soon follows. That is why Jesus never said, "Believe and relax." He said, "Watch." He never said, "Assume you are ready." He said, "Be ready." Because readiness is not a one-time decision, it is a posture of the heart. The final trap works quietly, slowly, comfortably, disguised as peace. But Jesus warned us because peace without watchfulness becomes sleep, and sleep is exactly what the final trap depends on. Part 3. Many will be deceived, who Jesus was really talking to. When Jesus Christ spoke the words, "Many will be deceived," he was not speaking to the world at large. He was speaking to his followers. That detail alone changes everything. Jesus was not issuing a general warning to humanity. He was giving a personal alert to people who already believed, already followed, already trusted him. This is where many believers misunderstand end-time deception. We imagine deception as something obvious, false religions, open denial of Christ, blatant evil. But Jesus' warning was far more sobering. He described deception that operates quietly within belief, not outside of it. A deception that does not remove faith but reshapes it, softens it, dilutes it. Deception in the final days is dangerous, precisely because it feels convincing. It doesn't arrive announcing itself. It does not say, "I am false." It comes dressed in familiarity, in confidence, in spiritual language, and most of all, it comes to those who believe they are already secure. Jesus warned that false voices would arise, and that they would deceive many. But again, the key question is, who are the many? They are not people who reject truth openly. They are people who assume they already know it well enough to stop guarding their hearts. One of the most subtle forms of deception is spiritual assumption. The belief that past obedience guarantees future readiness. The belief that knowledge replaces vigilance. The belief that because we started well, we will automatically finish well. Jesus repeatedly challenged this mindset. He spoke of lamps that went out, of servants who fell asleep, of fields where weeds grew unnoticed among wheat. These are not images of rebellion. They are images of neglect. And neglect does not feel dangerous in the moment. It feels harmless. It feels reasonable. It feels justified by busyness, by exhaustion, by routine. This is why deception works best among sincere believers. Because sincerity can blind us to the need for self-examination. We confuse intention with condition. We assume that because our hearts once burned, they still do. Jesus never said deception would only target those outside the faith. In fact, he warned that deception would be so persuasive that even those who considered themselves chosen could be affected. That is not a statement meant to cause fear. It is meant to produce humility. Humility is the antidote to deception. A humble heart stays teachable. A humble heart keeps listening. A humble heart keeps watching. But a confident heart that stops checking itself becomes vulnerable, even if it is well-meaning. Jesus warned because he knew something we often forget. The longer we walk with God, the easier it is to rely on memory instead of relationship. We remember how close we once were. We remember what God once did, and slowly we begin living on yesterday's oil. Deception doesn't always change what we believe. Sometimes it changes how seriously we live what we believe. And that is why Jesus' warning was not dramatic. It was surgical. He wasn't trying to scare his followers. He was trying to keep them awake. Part 4. The Trap of Spiritual Sleep. Spiritual sleep is not the absence of faith. It is the absence of awareness. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths Jesus revealed. A person can believe in him, serve him, speak his name, and still be asleep. Spiritual sleep does not mean rejecting truth. It means losing sensitivity to it, losing urgency, losing expectation. Jesus warned his disciples again and again to stay awake. That command alone tells us something important. Sleep is possible, and not just for unbelievers, but for followers. Spiritual sleep does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. It begins when watchfulness is replaced by routine, when prayer becomes habit instead of hunger, when scripture becomes familiar instead of piercing. People who are spiritually asleep often don't feel far from God. That's what makes it so dangerous. Sleep feels like rest. It feels peaceful. It feels safe. But rest without alertness becomes vulnerability. Jesus described people in the last days as continuing life as normal, eating, drinking, marrying, until sudden interruption. Not because these activities were sinful, but because they consumed attention. Hearts became anchored to the present world instead of anchored to eternity. Spiritual sleep thrives in comfort. When life feels manageable, urgency fades. When faith becomes socially acceptable, watchfulness weakens. When days are full, prayer becomes squeezed to the margins. Jesus did not warn his followers to avoid life. He warned them not to lose focus while living it. The danger of spiritual sleep is not that people stop believing Jesus is coming. It's that they stop living like he could come at any moment. And when expectancy fades, preparation fades with it. Sleep dulls discernment. A sleeping heart does not easily recognize subtle compromise. It does not notice small shifts in priority. It does not feel alarm when love grows colder or passion weakens. This is why Jesus' call to wake up is always personal. He never said, make sure others are awake. He said, you watch, you be ready, you stay alert. Because no one can stay awake for you. Spiritual sleep convinces believers that delay is harmless, that tomorrow is guaranteed, that there will always be time to get serious later, but later is the enemy of readiness. Jesus did not warn about sleep because he wanted anxious followers. He warned because he wanted present ones, awake ones, hearts that live with eternity in view. And this is the turning point. Because the moment you recognize the danger of spiritual sleep is the moment you can choose to wake up. Part 5. Why this trap works so well in the final days. There is a reason this final trap is so effective, and it is not because believers are weak. It is because the environment of the last days is perfectly designed to dull spiritual alertness without openly attacking faith. The enemy does not need to destroy belief when he can simply exhaust attention. Jesus understood this long before we lived in it. He knew the final generation would be surrounded by noise, constant information, constant urgency, constant distraction. Not all of it sinful. Much of it neutral, some of it even useful, but all of it competing for the most precious thing a believer has, attention of the heart. One of the reasons the trap works so well is because it hides behind good intentions. People are busy providing, building, serving, planning, fixing, improving. Life becomes full, days become crowded, and slowly, quietly, watchfulness slips from the center to the edges. The heart doesn't sit rebel. It gets tired. Comfort is another reason the trap succeeds. When survival is not threatened, urgency weakens. When faith does not cost much, it is easy to carry lightly. Jesus warned that the days before the end would feel ordinary, not chaotic at first, not alarming, ordinary enough that people would settle in instead of looking up. Routine is powerful. It trains the heart to expect tomorrow to be like today, and once that expectation settles, Readiness becomes abstract. The return of Christ becomes a belief instead of a living anticipation. Technology and constant connection amplify this effect. Minds are always engaged, always processing, always reacting. Silence becomes rare. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. And yet watchfulness requires space. Space to listen, space to notice, space to examine the heart. Another reason this trap works so well is because it does not attack doctrine. Believers still affirm truth, still confess faith, still speak about the rapture. But belief without posture becomes fragile. Knowledge without vigilance becomes dangerous. Jesus warned that love would grow cold, not disappear, cool, slowly, gradually. Coldness doesn't shock, it numbs. And here is the hardest truth. Many believers mistake peace for preparedness. They feel calm, so they assume they are ready. But peace that comes from comfort is not the same as peace that comes from surrender. The final days create an environment where faith can exist without focus, where belief can survive without urgency, where people can be sincere yet distracted. That is why Jesus did not warn about darkness alone. He warned about sleep, and sleep always feels harmless until it's too late. Conclusion. A loving wake-up call before it sips too late. Everything Jesus warned us about flows from love. He did not speak about the end times to frighten his followers, but to prepare them. He did not warn about traps to accuse, but to protect. And he did not call his people to watchfulness, because he doubted them, but because he knew how subtle the danger would be. The final trap is not about denying Christ. It is about drifting from awareness of him. It is not about rejecting truth. It is about postponing readiness. It is not about open rebellion. It is about quiet sleep. This warning is not meant to produce fear. It is meant to produce clarity. If you feel uncomfortable listening to this, that discomfort may be grace, not condemnation, grace. Because the most dangerous state is not when the heart is challenged, but when it is unexamined. Jesus never asked his followers to predict the day or hour. He asked them to live ready every day, to remain awake, to guard their hearts, to keep oil in their lamps, not once, but continually. The rapture is not a threat to believers, it is a promise. But promises still require readiness. Love still calls for response. Waiting still requires watchfulness. The good news is this: waking up is always possible, right now. In this moment, awareness can return, urgency can be restored, the heart can be recalibrated. Jesus' set warning is not, "You have failed." It is, "Stay awake." And if there was ever a time to listen closely to Jesus Christ, it is now.